The end of World War II marked the close of an era, not just of conflict, but of vast, complex systems that had been rapidly constructed and expanded to support the war effort. Among these systems were the enemy radar stations, those hidden, often obsolete structures that had been critical to military operations. With the war's cessation in 1945, the fate of these installations, particularly those captured by the Allies, became a matter of logistical challenge, economic necessity, and shifting geopolitical strategy. As the dust settled, the full scale of the captured radar stations came into view. Allied forces, particularly the Americans and the British, found themselves in possession of thousands of radar sites scattered across Europe, Northern Africa, and the Pacific. These installations, some primitive and others highly sophisticated, were designed by the Axis powers, primarily Germany and Japan, as part of their broader air defense strategies. In total, at least 1,200 radar sites in Europe were in Allied hands by the end of 1945. The majority of these were located in areas such as France, Norway, the Netherlands, and Italy, where they had been used to track aircraft and warn of incoming attacks. In the Pacific, captured radar sites in places like the Philippines and New Guinea represented another critical aspect of the Allies' post-war acquisition. For the immediate post-war period, the most pressing challenge was simply determining what to do with these newly acquired facilities. Radar technology had been essential for the Axis powers, but with the war over, their strategic importance was unclear. Many of the stations were no longer relevant. The German systems, in particular, had been constructed at such a breakneck pace during the war that their maintenance was often subpar, and the equipment they housed was quickly becoming outdated. Some radar models, like the FUMG-39, had been cutting-edge in the early 1940s but were now considered obsolescent by the time the war ended. The economic strain of reconstruction and the limited resources available to the Allied powers made it unfeasible to maintain every captured radar station. Instead, the decision was made to assess the value of these sites through a combination of engineering evaluations and geopolitical priorities. Some radar stations, particularly those located in regions of strategic value, such as along the Western Front or near major maritime routes, were maintained and upgraded for Allied use. These sites were repurposed for air traffic control, early warning systems, or even as training grounds for the newly reformed air forces in Britain, France, and the United States. However, most captured radar stations were not so fortunate. The vast majority were simply abandoned or dismantled. Their concrete foundations, rusted metal frames, and outdated components were left to decay in the forests of northern Europe or along the Mediterranean coasts. For instance, in France, where over 200 German radar stations had been constructed, many were quickly deemed unnecessary by the new French government. The stations in rural areas were demolished or left to collapse under the weight of time and neglect. In some cases, the captured radar stations were turned over to local governments or civilian contractors, tasked with their demolition or removal of any remaining equipment of value. The logistics of this process were not simple. Disassembling a radar station, especially one that had been erected quickly during the war, was a labor-intensive task. Some installations had been built with heavy concrete bunkers that were not easily destroyed, while others had been constructed with minimal resources and would collapse on their own over time. Even if the stations themselves were rendered obsolete, some of the materials and components, particularly the radar dishes, control panels, and transmitters, had significant scrap value. These components, especially the German-built radar systems, were sought after by civilian scrap merchants eager to capitalize on the surplus of metal that could be sold for a profit. This led to the widespread dismantling and repurposing of many radar systems, as their raw materials could still be of value in a war-ravaged Europe that needed to rebuild itself. But the capture of enemy radar stations wasn't just a matter of scrapping. The intelligence value of these sites loomed large. The Allies, particularly the British and the Americans, had been engaged in extensive efforts to decode and reverse-engineer Axis radar technology. After the war, a new priority emerged: salvaging as much usable technology as possible for research. In this sense, the captured radar stations became invaluable laboratories for post-war military and civilian scientists alike. many radar systems were carefully dismantled and shipped back to Britain and the United States for further analysis, allowing for the reverse engineering of their components and the adaptation of new technologies for civilian uses. One of the most notable examples of this was the German Würzburg radar system, which had been one of the most advanced of its kind in the world. After the war, American engineers studied this system extensively, learning not only about its functionality but also about the innovative techniques used by the Germans to reduce the size of radar equipment without sacrificing power. The Würzburg radar became a template for American developments in radar technology during the Cold War, particularly in the fields of air traffic control and early warning radar systems. This was a marked shift from the initial post-war aim of simply eliminating these captured stations. Instead, they became a repository of advanced military technologies that the Allies sought to understand and adapt for their own uses. The fate of radar stations captured in the Pacific was somewhat different, reflecting the different priorities of the Allied forces in the aftermath of the war. In the Pacific theater, Japanese radar systems had been largely rudimentary compared to the more advanced German models. However, many of these systems had been used with great effectiveness during the war. The capture of Japanese radar stations, such as those in the Philippines and New Guinea, provided valuable insights into the capabilities of the Japanese military as well as the weaknesses of their radar systems. These captured systems were similarly studied by American engineers, and some were repurposed for use in the post-war Pacific theater. In terms of pure disposal, however, the Pacific radar stations were often left to languish in place. This was particularly true in remote regions, where the logistical challenge of dismantling or repurposing these stations was simply too great. By the time the war ended, the focus had shifted almost entirely to rebuilding the infrastructure necessary for a peacetime economy. Consequently, many captured Japanese radar stations were abandoned to the jungle, their components left to rot. The rapid disintegration of these installations, aided by the harsh tropical climates, made the process of recovery or reuse nearly impossible. Thus, by the end of 1947, the fate of most captured enemy radar stations was largely sealed. The vast majority had been abandoned, scrapped, or repurposed for military use. However, their disposal was not a simple process of destruction. In the wake of the war, these sites stood as silent witnesses to the immense scale of the conflict, to the speed of technological change, and to the shift from wartime priorities to post-war reconstruction. The captured radar stations had, in the years immediately following the war, become part of a larger, ongoing effort to repurpose military infrastructure for peaceful uses, but the overwhelming pressure of economic recovery would ensure that many would be left to decay into historical oblivion. By 1947, the immediate post-war chaos had somewhat abated. Yet, the massive task of integrating former wartime assets into a peacetime economy was far from complete. The United States, as the world's emerging superpower, had become the key player in this transformation. As the dominant Allied force, it inherited the largest share of captured Axis technology, including radar systems. The immediate goal was to prevent the spread of knowledge and technology to adversaries, particularly the Soviet Union, which was now seen as the next great global threat. The captured radar systems were not merely technical curiosities. They represented the cutting edge of military technology. This realization led to a more deliberate and methodical approach to dealing with these installations. Unlike the rapid dismantling seen in the first few years after the war, the period from 1947 onwards saw more systematic efforts to repurpose these stations, often with an eye toward strategic intelligence. The remnants of the Nazi radar programs, for instance, became valuable for understanding how the Germans had achieved such impressive technological feats under wartime conditions. Some of these systems, like the powerful Würzburg radar, were taken back to the United States for detailed analysis. At the same time, the presence of thousands of German radar sites across Europe posed a unique problem for the Allies. The stations themselves were located in areas that were geographically and politically significant. For instance, many of the radar stations in France and Belgium had been positioned to cover key air corridors and ports, making them of continued strategic value. In the immediate post-war years, the United States began using these sites for air defense purposes. Some of the radar systems were modified and integrated into the early warning systems of NATO countries as part of a broader effort to establish defensive networks in Europe against the Soviet threat. The repurposing of captured German radar stations was not limited to military applications. Some sites were handed over to civilian authorities for use in the growing field of commercial aviation. The rapid expansion of air travel in the post-war years meant that the need for radar systems to help guide civilian aircraft became critical. By the late 1940s, radar was becoming essential for both air traffic control and meteorological purposes. Therefore, in several cases, former Axis radar installations were adapted to serve these new functions. Their transition from military to civilian use marked one of the most unexpected and productive outcomes of their post-war fate. Radar stations that had once warned of enemy bombers or guided military operations were now used to direct passenger planes, facilitating the dawn of the modern aviation age. In addition to these more practical uses, the radar sites also became an important part of early Cold War intelligence efforts. The Allied powers, particularly the United States and Britain, were concerned not just with the technology itself but also with the data it had once gathered. The Axis powers had used these radar systems to monitor both air and naval activity, and their ability to track and intercept enemy communications was seen as highly valuable in the newly emerging geopolitical landscape. Many of the captured radar sites, especially those along the Eastern and Southern European fronts, were used as listening posts to intercept Soviet and Eastern Bloc communications during the early years of the Cold War. While some stations were repurposed or reused for intelligence and defense purposes, the majority were not so fortunate. The sheer scale of the number of captured radar installations meant that there was little time to salvage them all. For most of the abandoned sites, the process was slow and destructive. In Germany, France, and Italy, entire networks of radar stations were left to deteriorate. Some of the concrete structures, built to withstand bombing raids, were left standing, but without maintenance, they crumbled into ruin. Over time, the sites became forgotten by all but local historians, enthusiasts, and scavengers. One of the most striking features of this abandonment was the continued presence of the physical remnants of the radar systems themselves. In many cases, the radar dishes, now rusting and warped from exposure to the elements, still stood as silent witnesses to their former use. The equipment that had once been the height of technological innovation was now little more than scrap metal, left behind as Europe rebuilt itself. Local populations, particularly in areas like Normandy, found themselves living in the shadow of these decaying symbols of the past. However, it would be misleading to think that all radar sites were lost to history. Some of the radar stations continued to have military applications for many years after the war. In the early 1950s, as the Cold War intensified, the need for advanced radar systems became even more pressing. The U.S. military, particularly the Air Force, sought to build a comprehensive radar network that could detect Soviet bombers or missiles long before they reached American soil. To achieve this, they turned to the captured German radar systems for inspiration. Although many of the original installations had been abandoned or demolished, the technological designs and innovations pioneered by the Nazis were not lost. Engineers and scientists who had studied the captured systems adapted these blueprints to create the radar systems that would later form the backbone of America's Cold War-era air defense networks. In Britain, the situation was somewhat different. The British were keenly aware of the potential value of the captured German radar systems. The Royal Air Force and other military branches worked with local contractors to salvage and recondition as many radar components as possible. By the late 1940s, British radar installations, such as those located on the Channel Islands or along the southern coast, were operating in a much more streamlined fashion. They were used for air defense purposes as part of Britain's commitment to NATO and its defensive posture against the Soviet Union. In some cases, these radar stations remained operational well into the 1960s before being decommissioned. In the Soviet Union, the story was slightly different. While they had captured some German radar systems, the Soviets largely preferred to develop their own indigenous radar technology. The radar installations that the Soviets did acquire were, however, valuable for the knowledge they provided about Axis technological advancements. These systems were studied, reverse-engineered, and used to accelerate the Soviet radar program. It was not uncommon for Soviet engineers to visit captured radar stations in the Eastern Bloc, such as those in Poland and East Germany, to learn from the installations and adapt the technology for their own needs. Meanwhile, as Europe continued to rebuild and industrialize, some of the more remote radar stations that had been abandoned or destroyed found new uses in the civilian sector. In the 1950s, as the Cold War took shape, many former military sites were reimagined as communications hubs or meteorological stations. Their original function had been tied to military defense, but the growing demand for communication systems during the Cold War allowed these stations to continue serving a valuable purpose. Some radar stations were transformed into radio relay stations, or even early warning weather stations, integral to predicting the kinds of storms and climate changes that would affect both military and civilian operations. The gradual dismantling of these sites continued into the 1960s, but by then, the technological landscape had shifted significantly. The radar systems that had once been vital to wartime defense efforts were replaced by more advanced systems. The heavy, cumbersome equipment was no longer suitable for the fast-moving technological advances of the post-war world. It was at this point that most of the remaining radar stations, having outlived their military usefulness, were finally decommissioned and removed. By the mid-1960s, the legacy of these captured enemy radar stations was largely forgotten. However, the quiet collapse of these once powerful technological structures serves as a reminder of the broader shifts that took place in the aftermath of World War II. The fate of the captured radar stations reflected the changing priorities of a world emerging from war, a world where old technologies were discarded in favor of newer, more sophisticated ones, and where the material remnants of the conflict were slowly absorbed into the fabric of peacetime life.